The shocking murder of Keith Green missing, a Ferrari, and the dark truth behind the new boyfriend. True crime documentary. Hook. He went missing. The new boyfriend got a Ferrari. But what if everything you knew about them was a lie? The twists you won't see coming. Secrets. Betrayals. And a game that could cost her everything. Stay with me to uncover the truth, because you won't believe who's really pulling the strings. Hit that subscribe button, because the story's just getting started. Don't blink, or you'll miss the shocking ending. The air felt heavy. Thick. A strange tension hung in the streets of the small town. Keith had disappeared. Gone without a trace. No phone calls, no texts. Nothing. His girlfriend, Lisa, was frantic. Her mind raced with thoughts, none of them good. The police had searched for weeks, but there was nothing. Not a single clue. And then came the new boyfriend. Aaron. Tall. Handsome. Charismatic. He was quick to step in. Comforting. A little too comforting. He seemed eager to help, but something didn't feel right. The more Lisa thought about it, the more she felt it in her gut. That knot. That sense of unease. And then, one evening, Aaron pulled up in the driveway. A sleek, black Ferrari. It gleamed under the streetlights. Too perfect. Too out of place. Lisa stared at the car for a long time. The engine purred as Aaron stepped out. He smiled. But it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was something colder. Something unsettling. Lisa's heart beat louder in her chest. She tried to push the thought away. But it gnawed at her. Something about the car didn't sit right. It didn't belong. The whole town knew Keith's dream was to own a Ferrari. But he never had the chance. And now Aaron had one. She couldn't shake it. She had to know more. Lisa walked closer, her steps slow, deliberate. Aaron noticed her. His smile faltered. He shifted on his feet. He was nervous. The look in his eyes gave him away. He wasn't just hiding something. He was hiding everything. And just then, a sudden thought hit Lisa like a lightning bolt. What if Aaron had something to do with Keith's disappearance? No. No, she couldn't think like that. But the questions kept swirling. Where was Keith? Why the Ferrari? And why was Aaron acting so strange? Lisa took a step back. Her stomach churned. Her head spun. She had to find the truth. No matter the cost. Lisa couldn't ignore it anymore. The questions had taken root. And they clawed at her. She had to get answers. Aaron was still smiling, but it was hollow. Empty. She took another step back. Then she turned. Her eyes locked on the darkened house behind her. Keith's house. The house that once felt like home. It now seemed like a crypt. The silence inside was deafening. She couldn't bear it any longer. She had to go inside. Had to find something, anything. Lisa walked past Aaron, her pulse racing. He didn't stop her. Instead, he just watched, that same smile never leaving his face. As she entered the house, the stale air hit her. It smelled of dust and something off. She moved carefully, her every step echoing in the empty hallway. The dim light from the kitchen barely reached the front door. It was too quiet. Too still. The shadows in the corners felt alive. Lisa's heart hammered in her chest. She made her way to the living room. She froze at the sight of Keith's things. His jacket, still draped over the back of the chair. His sneakers left by the door like he just stepped out. The picture frames on the mantel, now empty. It felt like a memory, suspended in time. Nothing made sense. Her hands trembled as she reached for his jacket. She felt it. Something was inside the pocket. A small, crumpled piece of paper. Her breath caught in her throat. Lisa unfolded it carefully. The words were rushed, almost frantic. It was Keith's handwriting. But the message. It sent a chill down her spine. Underscore. If anything happens to me, look for the Ferrari. Underscore. Her eyes widened. It couldn't be real. She clutched the paper harder. Her mind raced. The Ferrari. That damn car. Had Keith known? Had he suspected something? And now, what was she supposed to do? She looked around, panic creeping in. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. Lisa spun around. It was Aaron. Standing in the doorway. His smile was gone. Replaced by something darker. Something she hadn't seen before. His eyes locked onto hers. And that's when she knew. He had been waiting for her. The sound of the Ferrari's engine grew fainter. But Lisa didn't dare relax. Not yet. Her body trembled with fear and adrenaline, each breath shallow. Her mind raced, spinning in a million directions. Had Aaron really left? Or was he just biding his time? The shed was dark. Silent. It felt like a tomb. Lisa pressed her back against the wall, straining to hear any sound, any movement. But there was nothing. Just the night air, cool and crisp against her skin. And the steady beat of her heart. She couldn't stay here forever. She needed a plan. She needed help. She couldn't let him get away with what he'd done. What he was planning. Her fingers brushed the crumpled paper in her pocket. The words from Keith echoed in her mind. Underscore if anything happens to me, look for the Ferrari. Underscore. The Ferrari. Lisa's eyes flicked to the small window at the back of the shed. She couldn't see much, just darkness and a sliver of moonlight. But there was something out there. Something waiting. And Aaron's words kept ringing in her ears. Underscore. You were never part of the plan. Underscore. The plan. What was the plan? Lisa's thoughts swirled, trying to make sense of everything. Had Aaron been part of Keith's life all along? Had he been manipulating her, pulling the strings from the start? No. No, she couldn't think like that. She couldn't let the fear control her. She had to focus. She had to keep moving. She crept to the door, peeking through a small crack. The alley was empty. She didn't see Aaron. But something else caught her attention. A figure. A shadow moving in the distance. A flash of headlights. The Ferrari. It was back. Her stomach dropped. How had he found her so quickly? No. She had to be sure. She couldn't make another mistake. Lisa waited, breath held. The figure moved closer. Closer still. She could see the car now, parked at the end of the alley. Aaron was out of the car, standing in the shadows. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning the area. Lisa's pulse raced. She had to think fast. He was getting closer. Closer to where she was hiding. Her heart slammed against her ribs. It wasn't safe here. But if she ran, he would see her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, even from a distance. The fear, the terror, began to creep back in. No. She couldn't fall apart. Not now. She looked around the shed, frantically searching for something, anything that could help her. Her eyes locked on a small gardening tool on the floor. A trowel. Not much, but it was something. Her fingers closed around the handle. The metal felt cold against her palm. Aaron's footsteps drew nearer. Lisa's breath quickened. She steadied herself, holding the trowel tightly. She would fight. If she had to, she would fight with everything she had. Her mind raced through every scenario. What was her next move? Should she wait until he was close enough to ambush? Should she make a run for it? She clenched her teeth. She wouldn't be trapped again. She couldn't. And then, the shed door creaked open. Lisa froze. The light from the alley poured in, illuminating the dark space around her. Aaron's silhouette stood in the doorway, blocking the only escape. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, everything stopped. It was as if time had paused, suspended in that one breathless moment. And then Aaron grinned. "I knew you'd be here," he said, his voice low and mocking. Lisa's grip tightened around the trowel. Her body trembled, but she refused to let him see her fear. He stepped closer. Closer still. The door behind him was wide open now. The outside world, her chance at freedom, lay just beyond. But Aaron was standing between her and escape. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. But Lisa saw through the lie. She knew better. He wasn't here to help. He wasn't here to save her. He was here to finish what he'd started. Lisa's feet pounded against the pavement as she raced toward the street, each step feeling like it could be her last. The Ferrari was no longer chasing her. At least, not directly. But she didn't dare look back. She couldn't. Not yet. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she pushed through it. The street was just ahead. The lights from distant cars blurred as she ran, the world spinning in a frenzy around her. She was almost there. But then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. A man. His silhouette was tall, broad-shouldered, but unfamiliar. Lisa skidded to a stop, her heart leaping in her chest. She had no idea who he was. Her eyes darted toward the car. The Ferrari was still behind her, idling now, its headlights casting an eerie glow across the road. But the man in front of her didn't move. He just stood there, staring at her. "Who are you?" Lisa gasped, voice shaky. His eyes were dark, but his expression. It was hard to read. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. Lisa's pulse raced. She didn't know if she should trust him. But there was something in his demeanor that told her he wasn't part of Aaron's plan. He wasn't here to hurt her. I don't have time," she said, her voice quivering. The man stepped closer, his movements deliberate but not threatening. "I know," he said softly. Before Lisa could react, he pulled something from his coat pocket. A badge. A silver, glinting badge. She froze. "Police?" she asked, breathless. He nodded. "I'm Detective Thomas," he said. Lisa's mind spun. Was she dreaming? Was this real? "I've been looking for you," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "For me?" Lisa took a cautious step back. Her thoughts were scattered. She wanted to believe him, but everything felt wrong. How had he known? How had he found her? "You're not safe here," he said. Lisa shook her head, trying to focus. "There's a man," she started, her voice shaking. "Aaron. He's involved in..." But Detective Thomas interrupted her. "I know who Aaron is." The words hit Lisa like a slap. "How?" she demanded, panic rising. But before Thomas could answer, the sound of a door slamming shut pierced the air. Lisa's head snapped toward the Ferrari. Aaron. He was out of the car. He was coming for her. "You've got to trust me," Thomas said, his voice urgent. Lisa didn't have time to think. She turned and ran, just as Aaron's voice echoed through the street. "You can't hide, Lisa!" His words cut through her like a knife. She had no idea where she was running anymore. Her legs were shaking, but she pushed herself forward. And then, another voice. Faint, but clear. "Stop!" Lisa's heart skipped. It wasn't Aaron's voice. It was a woman's. The woman stepped into view. Her face was familiar. It took Lisa a second to place her. It was Carla. Carla. Lisa's friend. Carla's eyes were wide with shock. She looked terrified. "Carla?" Lisa gasped, slowing to a stop. But then, something shifted in the air. Carla's face twisted into something dark. Her eyes gleamed with an unsettling malice. Lisa's blood ran cold. "You shouldn't have come back," Carla said, her voice low, menacing. Lisa's world spun. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, stepping back. Carla's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You never knew, did you?" Lisa's mind reeled. "Knew what?" she whispered, panic flooding her chest. "About Aaron," Carla replied. "He's not the one you should be worried about." Lisa's breath caught. And then, Carla stepped aside, revealing a figure behind her. A man. A tall, imposing figure. The last person Lisa ever expected to see. "Keith." Keith was standing there. Alive. But it wasn't the Keith she remembered. Not anymore. His eyes were empty. Cold. He didn't look at her. He didn't move. He just stood there, as if waiting for something. Waiting for someone. Lisa's knees went weak. She couldn't believe it. Keith. Keith was alive. But the man she had known, the man she had loved, was gone. And now, the real nightmare was only just beginning. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. Keith was alive. But it wasn't the Keith she remembered. The warmth, the spark, the life in his eyes gone. He stood there, as still as stone, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if unaware of everything around him. Carla stepped closer, her smile widening. "I told you," she whispered, her voice dripping with something dark. Keith didn't look up. He didn't speak. The silence was suffocating. Lisa's mind spun. This was impossible. It couldn't be him. It couldn't be. But there he was, standing in front of her, looking hollow. A puppet without strings. Lisa's legs felt like jelly, but she took a step back anyway. She needed to run. She needed answers. But something stopped her. A voice in the back of her mind. Something was wrong. She had to know the truth. "What happened to you, Keith?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Carla's laughter cut through the air, a shrill sound. "You really don't get it, do you?" she mocked. Lisa's heart pounded, her hands trembling at her sides. "Get what?" she demanded. Carla stepped forward, her eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "Keith isn't who you think he is. Never was." Lisa shook her head, the words crashing into her like waves. "What are you talking about? This doesn't make sense." But Carla wasn't done. "You always thought Keith was a victim, didn't you?" Her words were like a slap in the face. "Like he was some kind of poor, innocent soul caught in the middle." Carla took another step, her voice low and dangerous. "Well, let me tell you something, Lisa. He wasn't. He was always one of us." Lisa's stomach turned. The words hung in the air like a fog. "Us?" she whispered. Carla's smile was pure venom. "Yes. Us. Aaron, me, and Keith." Keith finally moved. His eyes slowly lifted, meeting Lisa's for the first time. There was nothing in them. Nothing at all. The man she had known, the man she had loved, was gone. Lisa's pulse quickened. The pieces were starting to fit together, but they didn't make any sense. She had to get out of here. But something in Keith's gaze kept her rooted to the spot. "You knew, didn't you?" Carla sneered. "Keith and Aaron, they were always planning this. The Ferrari. The money. The lies. You were just a distraction. A tool for their game." Lisa staggered backward, her head spinning. Her whole world was collapsing. Keith had been part of it. Part of the scheme. She had been nothing more than a pawn. But why? Why had he lied to her? Why had he let her believe the worst of Aaron? Her voice cracked as she demanded, "Why, Keith?" Keith didn't respond. He just stood there, his face empty. Carla's laughter echoed around them. "Don't bother asking him. He's not the man you remember." Lisa looked from Carla to Keith. The truth, ugly and unthinkable, was falling into place. And then, the fear set in. This wasn't just about Keith anymore. This wasn't just about Aaron. This was something bigger. Something that Lisa couldn't outrun. The world around her was crumbling, and the people she trusted the most were the ones who had betrayed her. Lisa turned and ran. She didn't know where to go, but she couldn't stay here. Not with Carla's mocking laughter behind her. Not with Keith's cold, empty gaze following her every move. She didn't look back. She couldn't. All that mattered was getting away. She raced down the alley, her feet slamming against the concrete. She could hear footsteps behind her, but she didn't dare turn. She didn't know who was following. She didn't care anymore. Her body burned with exhaustion, but she pushed herself harder. She had to get to safety. To somewhere, anywhere, where she could figure this out. But then, a car pulled up beside her. A black SUV. The door swung open. A figure emerged. A familiar face. "Lisa, get in!" It was Detective Thomas. Lisa hesitated for only a second before she bolted toward him. Without a word, she jumped into the back seat. The door slammed shut behind her, and the engine roared to life. Thomas didn't look at her, his eyes focused on the road. But he spoke, his voice urgent. "They're going to be looking for you, Lisa. We need to get you somewhere safe. We need to talk." Lisa could barely catch her breath. She didn't know what to believe anymore. She didn't know who to trust. But one thing was certain, this was far from over. The nightmare was just beginning. The car sped through the night, the tires screeching as Detective Thomas floored the accelerator. Lisa didn't know where they were going. All she knew was that she had to get away. She had to make sense of the chaos. The world around her felt like a blur. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess. Keith, Aaron, Carla, none of it made sense. What had they done to her? Why had she been part of this twisted game? The city lights flashed by, but Lisa barely saw them. She was lost in the haze of her thoughts. Her mind kept returning to Keith's eyes. The emptiness in them. The coldness. Her heart ached, but there was no room for grief right now. She had to focus. She had to stay alive. The SUV took a sharp turn, and the familiar streets of the city disappeared behind them. Lisa glanced out the window, trying to make sense of where they were headed. Where was Thomas taking her? Her gaze flicked to him. He was silent, focused, his hands gripping the wheel with tense precision. He didn't look at her. She could feel the weight of the silence in the car. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice shaky. Thomas's eyes remained on the road. "We're going to a safe house," he said curtly. Lisa's breath caught. A safe house. It felt surreal. She didn't know if she could trust him. But right now, she had no choice. "Who are you really?" she demanded, her voice stronger now. Thomas didn't respond immediately. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rush of wind outside. Finally, he spoke. "I'm the one who's been investigating them," he said, his voice calm. "Investigating who?" "Aaron. Keith. Carla. Their whole network. They've been operating under the radar for years." Lisa's stomach twisted. A network? She tried to process the words, but they felt too much like a dream. "Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "I couldn't risk you getting too close. They were already watching you. They knew you were digging around." Lisa's breath caught. Watching her. Her thoughts flickered back to the strange feelings she had when Aaron first appeared in her life. How he'd always seemed to know where she was, what she was doing. "Why? Why me?" Thomas's jaw clenched. "They needed you, Lisa. You were part of their plan. But you were never meant to get this far. They underestimated you." Lisa's mind was spinning. A plan. She had been part of it all along, just like Carla said. But she hadn't known. She hadn't even suspected. Her hands gripped the edge of the seat as they turned down another dark street. Thomas's voice broke the silence again. "They were using you to get close to something bigger. Something dangerous." "What?" she whispered. Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning for any sign of pursuit. Then, with a quiet intensity, he spoke. "The Ferrari." Lisa's stomach churned. "The Ferrari?" she repeated, confusion flooding her mind. "It's not just a car. It's a symbol. It represents something much bigger than you realize. Aaron and Keith were using it to launder money, get access to people they shouldn't have been able to reach. But it's not just about money." Lisa could barely process the words. A car. A symbol. Everything she thought she knew about Keith, about Aaron, it was all a lie. "You still don't get it, do you?" Thomas continued, his voice darker now. "Keith wasn't the man you thought he was. He was always part of the plan. A pawn in a much bigger game." Lisa felt her pulse quicken. She couldn't catch her breath. This whole time, she had been chasing shadows, trying to put the pieces together, but she had been blinded by her own love for Keith. She had been a pawn too. No, not just a pawn. A tool. She was part of something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. He didn't look back. Lisa followed, her thoughts racing. What was this place? What had she walked into? As they approached the back door, a man appeared in the doorway. He was tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in all black. His eyes were calculating, sharp, like he was already sizing her up. "Detective Thomas," the man said, his voice low. "Who's this?" Thomas didn't waste a second. "This is Lisa," he said quickly, his tone commanding. "She's the one we've been tracking." The man's gaze flicked to Lisa. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, he stepped aside. "Come in," he said, his voice softer now, but still tense. Lisa hesitated. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was no sign of pursuit, no cars, no lights in the distance. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something big. She entered the building. The interior was dimly lit, cold. The air smelled of old wood and concrete, mixed with something metallic. There were no windows, just bare walls lined with filing cabinets and unmarked doors. It felt like a place built for secrets. Thomas led her down a narrow hallway, the only sound her footsteps echoing against the floor. "Sit," Thomas instructed, pointing to a metal chair in front of a small table. Lisa sat, her muscles stiff. Her mind was a storm, struggling to make sense of everything. The man in black took a seat across from her. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. "You're in deeper than you realize," he said, his voice steady but cold. Lisa's stomach twisted. "I know," she whispered. "I don't even know who I am anymore." The man gave a single nod. "I'm sure you don't. But you will soon enough." He pulled a thick folder from the desk and slid it toward her. It was stamped with a bold red seal. Lisa reached for it, her hands trembling. She opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Hundreds of them. Each one more disturbing than the last. Her breath caught as she looked at the first image, a grainy photo of Aaron, his face half shrouded in shadow, standing next to a man she didn't recognize. But in the background, just barely visible, was something that made her blood run cold. The Ferrari. She flipped to the next photo. This one was taken in an office, and Aaron and Keith were sitting at a table with several other men, foreign faces she didn't know. The Ferrari was parked outside. She flipped through more photos, each one showing Aaron, Keith, and others involved in secret meetings, shady deals, and strange transactions. Her chest tightened as she flipped to a photograph of a man holding a briefcase full of cash. It wasn't just money. It was part of a far-reaching network. Lisa's hands shook as she turned to the final photo. It was of a woman, standing alone in a warehouse, smiling into the camera. Lisa's heart stopped. It was Carla. But this wasn't the woman she had once known. In the photo, Carla looked different. Colder. Her eyes were hard, calculating. Lisa's mind screamed. This couldn't be real. She had trusted Carla. And now, it seemed like Carla had been working with Aaron and Keith all along. She flipped through the remaining pages of the file. More names, more faces, all linked to the same underground network. People Lisa didn't know. But they were all connected by one thing. The Ferrari. The car was the key to everything. And now, so was Lisa. Her body went cold as the realization hit her. She had been a pawn in something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. "Why me?" she asked, barely able to speak the words. The man in black leaned forward. "Because you were always meant to be. They planned it this way. Aaron, Keith, Carla, they'd been using you from the start. You were part of their game, but you didn't even know the rules." Lisa shook her head. "I don't believe this. How could they? They knew you'd get too close eventually," the man said. "Keith, he was the perfect cover. But it was always about the Ferrari. The car is how they're laundering money. It's how they're making connections with people you'll never even meet. And Carla? She's been feeding them information. She's the one who orchestrated your involvement. Lisa felt the walls closing in. Carla. Her best friend. The person she trusted more than anyone. And now, it seemed like Carla had been the puppet master all along. Where is she now? Lisa whispered. Somewhere you don't want to go, the man in black said. She's working with them, Lisa. But she's not the biggest threat. Lisa's eyes narrowed. Then who is? The man leaned back, his eyes hard. The one pulling the strings. The person behind everything. The one who controls it all. A chill ran down Lisa's spine. And for the first time, she realized the depth of what she was involved in. The strings were still there, pulling. And Lisa was no longer sure if she could cut them. The man in black's words hung in the air like a deadly omen. The one pulling the strings, Lisa whispered. Her heart thundered in her chest. The realization was suffocating. For the first time, she understood that everything, Keith, Aaron, Carla, had been part of something far darker than she could have imagined. Who are they? She asked, her voice shaking. The man in black didn't respond right away. He sat back in his chair, studying her, his face unreadable. It was like he was deciding how much to reveal, how much she could handle. Finally, he spoke. They're not who they seem to be, he said, his voice low. None of them are. Lisa's chest tightened. She wanted to ask more, to demand the answers, but a sense of foreboding settled over her. She could feel something shifting in the air, something dangerous closing in. The door to the room creaked open, and Lisa's pulse spiked. She turned sharply, expecting to see Thomas. But it wasn't Thomas. A woman stepped into the room. She was tall, her movements fluid, but there was something cold in her eyes. Lisa's breath caught when she saw the woman's face. It was Carla. But this wasn't the same woman she had known. This Carla was dressed in a tailored suit, her hair pulled back tight, her expression unreadable. The warmth that once filled her eyes was gone, replaced by a calculating emptiness. Lisa felt her stomach drop. Carla, she whispered. Carla's lips curled into a tight, almost imperceptible smile. I see you've been getting answers, she said, her voice smooth, like silk over steel. Lisa's head swam with disbelief. What was going on? Was this some kind of elaborate trap? Had Carla been playing her all along? The man in black stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Lisa, meet Grace, he said, as if it were the most natural introduction in the world. Lisa's mind reeled. Grace? Her gaze flicked between the two of them. Grace looked at her with an unreadable expression. I've been watching you, Grace said, her voice cold. You have potential. More than you realize. Lisa's throat went dry. You've been a part of something bigger than you could have known, Grace continued. This whole time, we've been testing you. Lisa felt the blood drain from her face. Testing her? For what? Testing me? Lisa repeated, barely able to speak the words. Grace's eyes narrowed. You're smart, Lisa. Smarter than they gave you credit for. You've always been a pawn in their game, but now you're more than that. You're a player. The words hit Lisa like a punch to the gut. A player? How could she be a player in a game she never knew existed? Grace took a step closer, her voice becoming more intense. You have something they want, she said. The Ferrari isn't just a car. It's a key. A key to something much bigger than any of us. Lisa's mind was spinning. The Ferrari was a key? A key to what? Grace didn't give her a chance to ask more. You're going to help us get it, she said, her voice now sharp with purpose. Lisa's heart slammed in her chest. Help them? Help them get the Ferrari? No. She couldn't. She wasn't part of this game. Not anymore. You're wrong, Lisa said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. I'm not part of this. I don't want any part of whatever you're doing. Grace's smile didn't falter. It's not a choice, Lisa. The words were cold, final. The man in black, who had been silent until now, spoke. Grace is right. You don't get to walk away. You're in this, whether you like it or not. Lisa stood up, her hands trembling with the weight of the moment. She had no idea what they were talking about. But she knew one thing: this was her breaking point. She had to get out. She had to find a way to escape before it was too late. But the moment she moved, the door behind her slammed shut. Lisa froze. The sound echoed in the small, dimly lit room. Grace stepped forward, blocking the only exit. You're not going anywhere, she said, her voice hard as steel. The man in black gave her a sharp look, his eyes cold, calculating. No more running, Lisa. Lisa's heart pounded in her ears. She was trapped. The walls were closing in. They had her exactly where they wanted her. But something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let them control her. Not like this. Not anymore. With a surge of adrenaline, Lisa rushed toward the door, shoving past Grace. The woman didn't move fast enough. Lisa broke free and ran down the hallway, her breath ragged, her feet pounding against the cold concrete floor. She didn't know where she was going. But she couldn't stop. Not now. She burst through the back door, into the darkness of the night. But before she could get far, a figure stepped into her path. She skidded to a halt, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Thomas. Stop, Lisa! He called, his voice urgent. But it was too late. Lisa was already running again. Lisa didn't stop. She couldn't. Thomas's voice echoed in the night, but it only pushed her faster, the panic surging through her veins. Her feet hit the gravel with sharp, desperate steps, and the world around her blurred into nothing more than dark shadows and echoes of her own breath. She didn't dare look back. The fear was too real. Too close. Her mind raced, heart pounding like it might burst out of her chest. What had she just stepped into? What had she been a part of all this time? As she sprinted down the alley, her breath ragged in her throat, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Quick, relentless. Thomas. She couldn't let him catch her. Not when she didn't know what to believe anymore. Not when every part of her screamed that nothing was what it seemed. Her eyes darted around, seeking an escape, a place to hide. There. A narrow side street. She veered sharply to the right, her sneakers scraping against the pavement. The alley was tighter, darker. Her fingers brushed the cold stone walls as she forced herself forward. There had to be a way out of this mess. Somehow, she had to get the truth. Somehow, she had to make them all pay. But she couldn't think straight. Not with the sound of Thomas's footsteps growing closer. Her pulse roared in her ears as she pushed harder, faster. The end of the alley loomed ahead. A street lined with parked cars. If she could just reach the main road, she could disappear into the crowd. She could find help. She could. The sudden, jarring sound of tires screeching to a halt ripped her from her thoughts. Before she could react, a black car pulled up beside her, blocking her path. Her heart stopped. A door swung open. 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They moved toward her with the smooth, practiced precision of predators. Lisa froze. She was caught. The men didn't speak. They didn't have to. One of them grabbed her by the arm, yanking her toward the car. Let go! Lisa screamed, struggling against their grip. But the second man was already beside her, his hand clamping down over her mouth, silencing her. Her stomach dropped. This was it. This was what she had feared. She had no control. No escape. Get in the car, the man holding her arm ordered, his voice low, dangerous. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as they shoved her toward the back door. There was no fighting them. No way out. She had no choice but to comply. As the door slammed shut behind her, she glanced out the window, her mind racing. Where were they taking her? What were they going to do to her? The car pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly into the night. The 2 men sat on either side of her, silent, unmoving. Lisa was trapped. The city blurred past the windows, but she didn't register the streets. Her mind was on fire, questions flashing through her thoughts. Why had they taken her? Who were these men? Why was Thomas involved? What did they want with her? One of the men finally spoke. "You're going to help us finish this," he said, his voice cold and final. Lisa's head whipped around. "Finish what?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. The man didn't answer immediately. He glanced at his partner, then back at her. "The game," he said simply. The words hit her like a punch. The game? The game she hadn't asked to be a part of. The game that had torn apart everything she thought she knew. The Ferrari. Aaron. Keith. Carla. The lies. The betrayals. Lisa could feel her pulse quicken, the terror rising again. And in that moment she knew she was in deeper than she could have ever imagined. The game was no longer something distant. It was her life now. And she didn't know how much longer she could survive it. The car sped faster, the city lights fading as they drove further into the unknown. With every mile, Lisa's sense of dread deepened. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her. The silence was suffocating, thick with unspoken promises. The worst part? She had no idea who was pulling the strings anymore. Was it Grace? Was it Carla? Or was it someone even higher up? One thing was certain, if she didn't find the truth soon, she wouldn't make it out alive. And the clock was ticking. The game was about to get a whole lot deadlier. The car slowed to a halt, its tires crunching on the gravel. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest, her hands shaking as she stared through the darkened window. Where were they? The car door opened without warning, the cold night air rushing in, mixing with the stale tension inside the vehicle. One of the men yanked her roughly from her seat, pulling her out into the night. Her feet barely touched the ground before they were dragging her toward an old, weathered building. A warehouse. The same kind of place where secrets were buried, where people vanished, never to be heard from again. The door creaked open, and the dim interior stretched before her, filled with shadows and dust. Lisa's mind raced. She couldn't believe she was here, trapped in a place like this, with no way out. She had to think. Had to fight. But the cold steel of the gun pressed against her ribs told her that running wasn't an option. Her breath caught. One of the men shoved her forward, his grip tight on her arm. "Move!" he growled, his voice low, dangerous. She stumbled, her pulse thundering in her ears. Where was Thomas? Where was anyone? The man ushered her into a back room, where a single light flickered overhead. In the center of the room was a large, old wooden table. Around it sat several figures, all wearing dark suits, their faces hidden in shadow. But one face stood out. Grace. She was seated at the far end of the table, her eyes cold and piercing. Lisa froze. "Sit," Grace commanded, her voice as sharp as a blade. Lisa obeyed, her legs weak beneath her. She couldn't look away from Grace's unblinking gaze. "You've been very useful, Lisa," Grace continued, her tone almost mocking. Lisa clenched her fists, her mind still reeling. "You think I'm part of this?" she spat, her voice trembling with fury. Grace smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You already are. You always were." The words hit Lisa like a slap. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the truth was undeniable. Everything, the Ferrari, the network, Keith, Carla, had been orchestrated long before she even knew what was happening. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about control. And Lisa was the final piece they needed. Grace leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. "You're going to help us finish what we started," she said, her voice calm, almost comforting. Lisa's heart sank. "You're insane," she whispered, her voice breaking. Grace's eyes narrowed. "You're not the one making the decisions anymore, Lisa. You're a part of something bigger now. And there's no going back." The air in the room grew colder, heavier, suffocating. Lisa's mind raced. She had to act. But what could she do? They had the power. They had the control. And yet, in the midst of the darkness, something inside her flickered. A spark of defiance. Grace was wrong. Lisa wasn't just a pawn. She was a player in her own right. And it wasn't over. Not yet. With a surge of adrenaline, she stood up, knocking her chair back violently. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the nearest object, a glass ashtray, and hurled it at the nearest man's head. The glass shattered, and the man staggered back, clutching his face. Before anyone could react, Lisa bolted. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She ran. Her feet pounded against the cold, concrete floor as she raced toward the exit. Grace's voice echoed behind her, sharp and commanding. "Stop her!" But it was too late. Lisa was already halfway out the door, her breath ragged in her throat. She had no plan. No idea where to go. But she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let them control her. Not anymore. As she ran into the night, the weight of her decision hit her. She was in too deep now. There was no going back. But one thing was clear. She would fight. She would survive. And when the dust settled, it would be on her terms. Lisa ran until her legs burned, until the cold night air stung her lungs and the world around her became nothing more than a blur of dark streets and flickering lights. She had no destination, no plan, just the overwhelming need to get as far away as possible. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the thundering of her thoughts. How had it come to this? How had she gone from a small-town girl trying to live a normal life, to being tangled in a web of lies, danger, and betrayal? She didn't know. But she couldn't afford to stop now. Not when she was so close to the truth. Lisa stumbled onto a quiet street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She leaned against the wall, trying to steady herself, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. The faces of Grace, the men in suits, and the ever-present shadow of Aaron haunted her thoughts. And then, somewhere in the back of her mind, a thought crept in, a possibility. She wasn't alone in this. There had to be someone she could trust. Thomas. He hadn't turned his back on her. He had warned her, tried to keep her safe. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, dialing his number without hesitation. It rang once. Twice. On the third ring, he answered. "Lisa." His voice was steady, but she could hear the worry beneath it. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do anymore, Thomas. I'm lost. This isn't just about the Ferrari. It's something bigger, something dangerous." "I know," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "I've been trying to find a way out too. You're not alone in this, Lisa. We'll figure it out. But you need to stay hidden. Trust me." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I trust you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Then listen to me," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You need to disappear, Lisa. We'll get to the bottom of this, but not yet. Not until it's safe. You're a target now, everyone is after you." Lisa closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had been running from the truth for so long. But now, she had no choice but to face it. Grace. Carla. Aaron. The game. It was bigger than all of them. But she wasn't powerless. Not anymore. "I'll go underground," she said, her voice resolute. "I'll stay hidden until we can put an end to this. But we will end it, Thomas. We will." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Thomas spoke again, quieter now. "I'll be in touch. Stay safe." "I will," she promised. As she hung up, Lisa felt something shift inside her. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely alone. The fear was still there, the uncertainty, but she had something more now. A sense of purpose. A plan. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And when it was done, when the dust finally settled, Lisa would walk away with the truth, and with her life. But for now, she would disappear into the shadows. She would bide her time. And she would wait for the moment when she could strike back. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun.